Increase. You tell me when we are online. Are we on? Okay. I actually don't see anything. Am I online or not?
You are on the left.
See myself. Would like to see what they see. Would make it easier to move the camera. All right. Okay, that's here. All right. Can begin. So I think now technology is settled. Everybody is there. Apologies for the little delay. We had to fix a few things. Perhaps a few words of thanks to students and faculty who are present with us in the room. And to those of you who are online, thank you for having joined us. It's a great pleasure to actually open this semester with a great host, great guest, of whom I will speak in a moment. Before I actually perhaps say a few words about our department, a little bit about myself as well. The Department of Philosophy at Mahe Manipal is, as it was introduced, I guess, this morning, a dialogical space between India and the world. Of course, when we think of philosophy, it comes to mind that philosophy is something rather European or Mediterranean would be more accurate, but that's where it's born. At that time, Europe was not what we call Europe today, and that was the beginning. So we could say perhaps origins were Mediterranean, but even in those regions, they thought philosophy was Persian, Egyptian, somewhere from the East. But in the long course of history, philosophy moved westward and got paler and paler, so to say. And people, some of them, forgot. And by the time of Hegel, Kant, and so forth, then philosophy became European. And they would say, we coined the word, philo and sophia. And although there is a lot of, say, sophia in philosophy, the philo, the love, often became more the love of self than the love of wisdom. When we forget all the origins of that long trajectory of philosophy and narrow it down to some cultural area, I think we perhaps still have some part of wisdom, but at least the lack of love. And what is philosophy without this? In any case, here at Mahe, we try to have this dialogue. Of course, we focus on India because that's where we are. And there's a lot to say about philosophy here. And we cannot just do everything in every detail. So we have to focus. We are a small faculty, just a few staff, I think great staff. I hope you students will enjoy them. As much of our support staff, those who work behind the scene, but the teaching faculty as well. Those we invite and those like me, Professor Srinivasan, who are there more permanently. I think you are gifted to have access to these folks. I forget to mention our new colleague Vishnu as well, who will help you with Sanskrit. Forgive me on this. You will have quite a privileged access to these people because we're such a small number cohort. We are there for you, with you, from the beginning till the end. And it's really up to you just as much as you want to involve yourself with us. We'll do our best to carry you. Try to see where you want to go and how we can give you some direction. There are many directions in philosophy, some of which you might not even imagine right now. And I wish you take the time to explore it and discover, what speaks to you. And perhaps we start here at this MA, and in the near future, we have you as PhD students. It would be lovely to guide you there, where actually one becomes an adult in science and research. This to say perhaps a few words about me before I introduce our host. We do have something in common, Professor Sangita Menon and I. I focus on what I would call Jnana Yoga, right? The yoga of philosophy, or the yoga of reasoning, which I prefer to, or the yoga of knowledge, which I use in some of my work. At least that has been my work recently. That involves looking at philosophy not only in its, if you want, epistemological manner, logical manner, but looking at philosophy as a way of life, looking at philosophy as a transformative attempt to find out who we are, what we are, perhaps what we ought to be, and how to get there. Looking at how consciousness functions and how pragmatically we can approach this consciousness and work on it. It's not necessarily about discovering consciousness. It's more about rediscovering it or uncovering it, removing what veils it, removing what stands in front of our eyes that prevents us from seeing what's already there. At least that's more of the Indian approach, and that's what I'm mainly looking at. For my doctoral studies, I worked on doxographies, darshanas, classifications of schools. This I will give you a lecture on tomorrow. But so philosophy as a way of life, the discovery of consciousness, self, in dialogue with one another. By this I mean the multiple dialogue from darshana to darshanas, using dialectic as an inquisitive mean of knowing the other, and through this knowing, getting to know oneself, one's identity, and so forth. That has been a question that fascinates me. As for our esteemed guest who will now speak, Professor Sangita Menon, she is head of the Consciousness Studies program and the Dean of the School of Humanities at NIAS. She joined the National Institute of Advanced Studies in January 1996, the Indian Institute of Science campus in Bangalore. Let me see, I will skip a little bit. Let's say this, your position says this was the first academic group that started in India to study consciousness with an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary mandate. That's quite visionary and quite important in my eyes. So just for this, I would say, although there is more, I'm quite pleased that she accepted our invitation today. She currently heads the NIAS Consciousness Studies program and is the professor and dean of the School of Humanities at NIAS. Her major areas of research is philosophy of psychology. Her expertise is in Indian philosophy, consciousness studies, philosophy of psychology, philosophy and psychology of self, bio and neuroethics, and neurophilosophy. Needless to say, this is quite impressive. She works with her colleagues at NIAS and collaborators across the world in creating and encouraging a first-person centered approach to understanding consciousness and cognitive capabilities that favors experiential well-being for all. In this respect, I would say another thing we have in common is something that we will try to establish here at Manipal. I was with Srinivasan's permission, I'll be in the next years building a course called Clinical Philosophy, where we won't only, if you want, theorize about philosophy, but we will also learn how to apply it pragmatically in conversation, in dialogue with one another, as in counseling, or philosophical counseling, either for businesses, but for individuals, also philosophy with children, how to build philosophical workshop. All of this through the art of listening. How do we listen? Or if we don't know how to listen, we won't know how to ask good questions. And that would be two pillars of that course, listening and hearing. Sangeeta Menon, to come back to her again, started her research with a comparative study of consciousness from the East and the West, which focused on the theories of agency, emotion, freedom, self, and human well-being in the Bhagavad Gita. Quite impressive, and I look forward to hear a talk. Now I will say no more, abstract myself from here, and we pass on the microphone to our esteemed speaker. Please, Ms. Menon, if you are available, can we hear you?
Yeah, good morning, and I'm very much available.
Very well, okay.
But sir, I missed your name. May I know your name so that I can?
It must have been me. I don't.
Yes,
like
please.
to put my name up first. I'm Dr. Carl Stefan Boutiet. Pleasure to meet you.
Okay, I think I'll say Dr. Stefan, thank you so much for the kind words, and it's wonderful to know that we share interests, and I look forward to talking with you perhaps outside this classroom, and perhaps we can explore things together, later as well.
Definitely.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Srini. I'm assuming he must be in the audience and I'm just not able to see him now for inviting. Yeah, that's nice. It's nice that I can see you. I was really hoping to be there, and Dr. Srini knows that I was very much wanting to come there and talk with you since it's an immersive program. But then it so happened that a lot of challenges were there, and I had to, myself settle with an online program. And so thanks once again, Dr. Stefan, for the kind introduction. And let me say that, in general, in philosophy, we move from the perceptible to the imperceptible. I have a lot of names which are imperceptible now. Can you make yourself perceivable? The Zoom, because what I can see is only names, and in case it's possible, can I see you because this is going to, as Dr. Stefan said, I cannot close my eyes and talk to you. So if I don't see you, it'll be basically like me closing my eyes and talking to you, because that little panel which I can see where about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people are sitting, very difficult to even make out who they are. I can't have any eye contact. So I am really requesting you, people who are here, can you show your videos, please, so that I know you are there, and if it's not a huge issue. Of course, if there's a bandwidth, let it go away later, but at least you can make an initiative. Yeah. Anand, Amit, Subhashri, Raman, Gautam. Are you there? Okay, Subhashri.
Yeah, I am here. This is Anand. Good morning. Good morning, madam.
Yeah.
I have a very serious issue on bandwidth. So please help. Please forgive me now.
Yes, I'm trying to come on video. Just give me a few minutes. I have to change my privacy settings and then I'll join the meeting with the video on. Thank you, ma'am. Welcome to the session, ma'am.
Yeah, so I think this is going to be a hard philosophical exercise for me, which is to talk about the imperceptible, starting from the imperceptible, which is not able to see something, and then talk about that which cannot be seen, the unseen. So thanks once again, Dr. Stefan, whom I don't see anymore, but I hope he's there. And all others, I'm assuming most of you are, according to Dr. Srini, most of you are, are students of the MA program who have just joined, and you had another set of program in the morning before this started. So I'm assuming all of you are there, and I don't know the names where the screen shares Mahe Manipal, but namaste to all of you sitting there. Namaste. And as I said, I have real difficulty, in speaking without speaking. I mean, seeing people and looking at their eyes, and that's my own disadvantage, I guess. Though I do abstract paintings, when it comes to speaking and dialoguing, I prefer more concrete and real people than abstract. But then that's how life is. I guess we have to, move on. So friends, first, can I have a little introduction about you? Because, I was just thinking this morning, I mean, this is a different issue, but I still, as students and maybe as resource people on this side, I was thinking, what is our education style that one person comes and speaks and all the other people just listens, and then Dr. Srini said last 30 minutes question answers. Our attention span is hardly for 2 minutes, and now talk about 60 minutes if I continue to speak. I mean, I guess I'm going to speak to myself and not to yours, not to you. So at least can I know who you are, so that, at least we can build a little bit of a relationship, and, a 2-minute relationship, and then perhaps carry on this. And I think the only people I know is Dr. Stefan, who kindly introduced himself, and Dr. Srini, who has been corresponding with me, and all the other people. Perhaps if I can have an introduction, both in the screen and offline and the online. Or maybe you have audio issues, right? If you to speak out, I guess. Okay.
Namaste.
Yes. I can hear you.
Yeah. Namaste, I am Sriharshwar. I have completed my Bachelor of Sciences from Usmania University. Now I have enrolled for the MA Indian Philosophy program. Thank you.
Thank you, Usman.
Myself, Sarvesh Samulkar. I have completed my bachelor's in computer application from Shivaji Science Nagpur. Now I am here for Indian philosophy.
Namaskaram, ma'am. I'm Akanksha. I've completed my bachelor's in animation from Hyderabad, and now I'm here at Manipal doing my MA in Indian philosophy.
Namaste, ma'am. I'm Vandita. I've completed my bachelor's in history, economics, and English major from a college in Bangalore, and now I'm pursuing MA in Indian philosophy.
Okay, maybe in the screen, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, see, my name is Anand. I did my Master of Engineering from Indian Institute of Science, and a retired person.
Yes.
Yeah, namaste. This is Ravi Shankar. I have done my master's in Sanskrit. Then now I have registered for PhD in Advaita. So my professor asked me to join. Actually, I'm an IT professional. That's what I do for a living. But out of passion, I pursued a master's just a few years ago. Then now I have registered for PhD.
Thank you.
Good morning, madam. I am Shamala Gopalakrishnan. Earlier, I had done my lab technician and I worked for 3.5 years. After marriage, I sat 10 years at home. Then when one son was in the third and the other was in the first, I did my BA, MA, MSc, and then PhD. For that, I took 9 years. I worked for 20 years and I took a voluntary. Now at the tail end of my life, I have done darshan from Somaya and 3 years of Ashtadhyayi from Somaya. I am 78 years old, presently at Dubai. Thank you.
Namaskara. I am Dr. Geeta Badkilaya. I am the founder trustee of an organization, Destination Heritage, and we are into heritage activities across the heritage subjects. So my weak point is literature and philosophy. So I am a part of a group of Sanskrit studies and they send this link. So since you are a professor from NIAS, I thought I can get some takeaways from this session. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I'm Vijay Sagar. I'm from Chennai. I'm working as an engineer. I was keen on doing this Masters in Sanskrit Studies program at Manipal, but I'm still. I have some issues to joining there. But I thought I would join this session since it's online and enjoy. Thank you.
Anybody else? The others, please.
I'm Dr. Subhashri, joining from Chennai. I work in Stella Maris College in Chennai, and I teach Sanskrit here as a foundation language. I've done my master's in Madras University and my especially those darshanas. So I'm interested to get back to my roots again. This being philosophy, which interests me a lot. So I want to hear many people who I know to talk in this few days now. So that's about me. Eagerly waiting for your session.
Has everybody said about themselves? I don't know whether everybody has introduced themselves. Okay. There's a lot of detachment to begin with, I guess. And when we talk about Indian philosophy, you know, the idea which comes forefront, at least to a certain extent, is detachment or giving up the worldly affairs and looking up something higher, deeper, and inner. But that's just a tongue-in-cheek comment. What I wanted to talk to you is about, and please show your videos if possible, because I just can't concentrate without looking at people. So if possible, you know, please show your videos if you don't have a bandwidth, and that will help you to reduce voyeurism and be participative as well. So today, the intent of this lecture, as far as I understand from Dr. Srini, is to orient to a topic like philosophy, and particularly Indian philosophy, because I guess that's what your department does. And what do we mean by Indian philosophy is a big question, because Indian geographically or you know, culturally or How about positioning it in the global south? So there's a lot of geopolitical, cultural issues the moment we utter a word like Indian philosophy. But then the idea of the Indian in Indian philosophy has been, if you follow a particular heritage and history of how philosophy has been discussed and debated in India, that idea of the Indian relates to somewhat historical in Indian philosophy, which means of a historical heritage that has started from certain texts of antiquity to a certain classical period, and perhaps to certain, maybe not a huge extent, but a brief extent at least, some of the contemporary thinkers as well. And of course, there are Indian philosophers who live in India and talk about Indian philosophy. There are Indian philosophers who live outside India, not necessarily be Indian, and they do work on Indian philosophy as well. So it's extremely difficult to position Indian philosopher or Indian philosophy, just by just the word of it. So it's important, I think, we remember what do we mean by Indian philosophy, because that's an extremely important question. So do we just pinpoint it to a particular history of antiquity, and then to a classical period, and then to a certain period of contemporaneity? Or do we make it a living tradition, even if it's a tradition, a living tradition, a living life practice, or a living enterprise, a living experience? So that question is very important. And it's also, I think, important for us to first understand what is metaphysics. Maybe some of you already have thought about it, some of you might have read about it, but what is metaphysics? That question, let us start, because I think I have titled my topic as Indian metaphysics. So if I don't say what is metaphysics, and our lecture will be very metaphysical and abstract, which I don't want it to be. So what is metaphysics is something perhaps all of you would have asked, or you will be asking in the coming 2 years, which you are going to be here in your classroom, or at least for just this next 1 hour and so, as long as you are going to be in the screen for this particular session. So of course, we are speaking using the language of English, which itself has a historicity. And the moment we talk in English language, the key words and the jargons are used in English. So that's the limitation which we do have, or perhaps that's a possibility as well as we have, because we can perhaps then extend to a large number of people from different countries and different cultures. The idea of metaphysics itself, the word metaphysics itself, as you know, would have more of Socratic origin and Greek origin, but then that's just the word, or just the meaning perhaps translated into English. But if you look at the engagement within metaphysics, you can very much say that metaphysics is also something very central to not only the Greco-Roman histories, but also to the many East Asian cultures, including Chinese, Japanese, and of course, Indian. So it's important we keep in mind, what do we mean by metaphysics? Its larger landscape, its larger geographical position. And within philosophy, metaphysics plays a big role, because I don't want to start now what is philosophy, because that question you would have already asked, and that's why you have joined this session, or you're sitting here. So I wouldn't go that into what is philosophy. But within philosophy, metaphysics play a big role. And even if you are an analytic thinker, even if you're an idealist or a realist, metaphysical discussions become very important because that is something very central to any philosophical thinking. And there are varied views about what metaphysics can deal with, or what exactly metaphysics will give you, provide you. But in very short, perhaps a brief, like a definition, metaphysics is something which we use, or it's something which we employ to understand what is not immediately perceived or immediately known. And that's why in the beginning I was sharing the joke that I have to start from the imperceptible to the perceptible, but I think nobody laughed. So I guess it didn't went through very well. So, so metaphysics basically has the contention that there are things which are not perceivable immediately. There are things which are not perceivable in an immediate context, and not knowable by perhaps in an immediate manner. So that's a contention which is already taken. So there is no critique to that, there are entities which are imperceivable, unknowable, or maybe not unknowable, but currently not knowable. And the rest of the concepts come under this. And what are those concepts? Well, there are several, and a couple of them are, one is the question about reality itself, whether what we perceive, how real it is, or how unreal it is, or how partially real it is. And then who is asking this question, and how is that person placed within the context of these questions, which is the question of the reality of what is experienced. And therefore the being of the person becomes very important. If you would know, being is a word perhaps which is very attractive for philosophers across the world. So if you look at even some of the philosophers in the West, you would have book titles starting with being itself. And here in India, across the Sanskritic tradition and other literature and other languages, you would see that this particular word is very much central to our discussion. Yeah, so just one second, so something popped up. Yeah, so being is very important, and let me just try. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint, but let me see if I can, pass on some ideas with you. So, okay, it doesn't come, I think. Right. Yes. Okay. Okay, slowly it's coming. So I hope people can see. This is another, I don't know whether you're aware, yesterday or just 2 days back, apparently the Amazon company discouraged people from using PowerPoint presentations in their own company. Because PowerPoint sometimes have bulleted, bulleted information, and takes away the feel of a narrative. Because finally, I feel philosophy cannot be just a few bulleted points. It has to be a narrative that you and I can share. So this is something which is very important, as I said, being, which is shared across traditions, across languages, and so on. Now, the range of ideas, which if you see, will also perhaps, has a longer extent. And let me just try to see if I can share the same with you. And so people talk about the real, ideal, and so on, and also that which is what is relational, perhaps something between real and ideal. And so this question of how do we understand the relationship between what is known to us and what is yet to be known, and how do we consider the nature of things, objects, people around us. So these words would be, I guess, will be important for our discussion, or any discussion of any philosopher, that how do we discuss or decide something as real, something as perhaps not so real, but perhaps in a more idealistic sense, and something maybe more as relational. And then there is also other positions such as non-dual, which is in all the perhaps the other previous positions, you have to have a binary. That means at least two as options, and then decide relatively or quantitatively which one is more real and which is less real. But then there can be positions that you don't have to go into the trap of the binary, but then perhaps perceive the two or more in a different, from a different mindset. So such approaches are also there, but I wouldn't go into that. I want to, before we start, I want to get back to what perhaps I am talking about as Indian metaphysics is. So one is we are talking about perhaps the cultural notions, and we are talking about philosophical notions, and perhaps we are also talking about artistic, and we are also talking about indigenous ideas, and where health, I'm sorry, the spelling of indigenous is wrong, health. So this is also something which is very important, because otherwise philosophical ideas will get catered to certain classical notions without any contemporaneity to it, and that is something which we have to critique in our discussions. So what at all do we include in the discussions of Indian metaphysics is something very important. So if you say the landscape of metaphysics itself includes cultural notions, of course, there are deep philosophical notions, but then there are also artistic notions, and there are indigenous notions. There are notions about health. And the popular idea when we talk about Indian metaphysics, or perhaps in metaphysics in large or philosophy in large, is that these ideas are more of abstract, and they have to be just given certain cerebral exercise, which means you just intellectualize it without a person inhabiting those ideas. So something which what AI is trying to do, like ChatGPT is trying to do. So a lot of plagiarism happens when we use ChatGPT, because it uses content which is already produced by you, me, and our friends in the internet space, and without a self, like a zombie behavior, ChatGPT can give you whatever is needed for your work. And then this is something which we have to be very careful, and that is why the question of self becomes very important in metaphysics. That who is the person behind these discussions? Is there a person at all? That question is also important. And what all would be the implications of any person involving in a metaphysical discussion? So that is why we have to keep in mind that metaphysics in general has to give place for artistic deliberations, our imaginations, our feelings, our emotions, the way we interact with people, the way we perhaps perceive our friends and our surroundings and environment. What are our intersubjective relationships? What are our interpersonal relationships, intrapersonal relationships? A lot of psychology comes into philosophy. So philosophy, though it talks about perhaps what psychology wouldn't go into, philosophy itself cannot be discussed, forgetting psychology, because there is a mind which engages with the philosophical questions. And if we don't perceive that mind, we cannot go forward. So that is why we first of all have to remember that we are here people with a mind, a personhood. And friends, my whole idea in trying to present this preliminaries is that when we talk about Indian metaphysics, we have to keep a large landscape, and that landscape has to involve and include cultural, indigenous, artistic, apart from the classical content, which we are already familiar with or we are going to be familiar with. Therefore, it's important to ask about metaphysical notions in indigenous communities. It's important to do comparative philosophy. It's important to read literature, which perhaps presents the philosophical topics in a very, very detailed and deeper and intense manner. Otherwise, we only will have the structure and framework and not perhaps an idea what to do with such a framework and theoretical spans. And definitely theories are important, but even for theories to be relevant, we have to extend the scope of our interaction, our own existence. Where do we exist? So that is why we have to remember that we just don't exist in that classroom, which has some nice bright light, which I can see, which is nice. But we also exist outside that classroom, perhaps, outside the 6th floor of Takshashila room. There are also things outside, right? I mean, there are people, there are tea shops, maybe there's a beautiful garden, and perhaps parents are coming, gardeners are coming. So there are a lot of people who exist. So philosophy cannot go forward without acknowledging the presence of the existence of these actual people who have hunger, thirst, desires. So one of the problem with philosophical thinking is that most of the time we think philosophy is for entities who do not have a self, like, for example, maybe ChatGPT, who do not have a self, who do not have an agency in it. But that's really wrong. Philosophy is for people who have agency, who will exercise their agenthood in sharing the philosophical ideas, testing the philosophical ideas in the ground. Otherwise, it is only going to take care of perhaps a very small portion of our neocortex, maybe not even the neocortex, because if the neocortex is going to be concerned with all that which is more of a contemporary origin in evolutionary history, just mugging up or just writing a few things, looking at from the books and texts, will not help us. So I think it's very important that we as fresh students remember that philosophy is an extremely exciting, extremely passionate enterprise. It's not a boring, just a cerebral engagement which we have to do. You can, of course, even do that, but then at the most, we can confuse ourselves, and definitely we can confuse others also in the process. But if we have truly, honestly be engaged with philosophy, then we have to bring in philosophy to our cultures and different landscapes as possible, and also acknowledge the people and the environment around us. That is why today you would know that feminist philosophy, ecological philosophy, and all plays a big role, particularly when we are talking about a topic like climate change, because it is people who are involved in climate change. It is not just, something is happening just by itself. It is people who are involved in it. Of course, that's a different topic. I wouldn't go into it. But what I wanted to reiterate with you, in spite of the difficulty of the Zoom meeting, is that finally we all involve with our sensory capacities, which is to not only just rationalize or just use our brain to think something, but also to feel it, to feel what you think, to touch what you think, and perhaps also to bring that feelings in our day-to-day activities, you know, our experiences when you meet a person, and our attitudes when you perhaps interact with other people, and when you go for a walk, and when you look at life from here or there or up or below. You know, it's all very important that philosophy is considered as a living entity and not as something which is of a classical nature. Of course, we may use classical languages, classical ideas, and maybe even historically look at classical periods. But that doesn't mean that the subject matter itself is relegated to a classical period alone. But it is very much contemporary, it is very much continuing, and it is very much immersive. Now, one example of what I'm saying can be actually seen from a classical text itself, such as the Mahabharata, which is one of my favorite texts. And I know that there are, I guess, studies happening in your center on Mahabharata. I don't know whether that is philosophy-based or language-based, but however, this text is very, very important. If you look at Mahabharata, the whole discussion on metaphysical ideas is based on real-time experiences of the several characters in the Mahabharata. So either these characters will give you a flashback of what has happened in their life, or perhaps they will project a future which has still not happened and perhaps imagine what could be there. And there are advisory philosophizing which you get from people, entities, objects, and people go through difficult and different situations, and these situations itself give you a larger framework of you know, what is perhaps to be understood in a deeper manner. And so there are several instances. And one of my favorite piece from the Mahabharata, apart from the Bhagavad Gita, is there is something called the Kama Gita, which perhaps some of you are aware of it. And this particular piece of Kama Gita is a critique, and it is actually a sarcasm. It's a sarcastic critique on desire. And some of the critiques sometimes on Indian philosophy is that, oh, we talk only about things in the sky, up above, nothing down below the earth. In fact, they have to look at what Kama Gita has to say. It literally dissects the psychological phenomenon of kama, desire, and understands the irony that perhaps desire is something which is not stoppable, or if it has to be stopped, or if it has to be at least understood or reviewed or analyzed, you have to have certain other stances taken. So there are several instances if you look at Mahabharata. I don't want to go into Mahabharata as such, but if you look at the irony of Arjuna, for example, that also is very, very interesting. The contradictions which he uses to justify his own psychological state, the false ethical principles which he promulgates to say that perhaps his inability to make a decision is good at that juncture. So ethics has been used, metaphysics has been used by Arjuna in the wrong time. And the usage of metaphysics and ethics in the wrong time doesn't help Arjuna, as you would see. I mean, that whole context of the war and the Gita shows you a very not a great picture of Arjuna, who's supposed to be otherwise a very accomplished person. So what I wanted to say is most of our texts, at least when it comes to literary texts like Mahabharata, gives you a very personalized notions about metaphysical ideas, which we otherwise discuss in isolation. So if you do Indian philosophy, please do also read Mahabharata. Please also understand the characters, their life trajectories. What were their challenges? What were their unique way of looking at people and situations and so on? So, so metaphysics also does get translated into particular styles, and it gets rendered in a way perhaps people can relate to. And therefore, you can say that the message of the metaphysics is also something which is perennial, and it doesn't stop. It is there. It is that we have to relate with it. So coming back to my original argument, or perhaps a position or a request to all of us, is that we should not relegate philosophy into something which is just speculative, something which is just cerebral, and something which just you can talk in a very high-flown manner, which you yourself won't understand, and let alone others. Philosophy has to be brought in within a very practical stance and a context. And now I would go into some of the ideas on consciousness, because that's something which I think I promised in the title and to Dr. Srini. So if you look at the Indian philosophical systems, which is classical, contemporary, and even what is going on now, will it be true to say that there is an urge or there's an interest to look at something which is not knowable immediately, something which is deeper, and there is something where you can see a possibility? I would think that Indian philosophy in general is a philosophy of possibilities. And sometimes these range of possibilities are shrouded by the unique concepts which make ideas abstract. But in spite of that, there is a space where people can delve and discover the possibilities for oneself. Perhaps this is one reason that the whole idea of knowing didn't get the foremost place in philosophical thinking. If you look at the range of philosophers from the historically, classically, and even contemporary times, even if you look at A.C. Bhattacharya and Matilal and so on, you would see that the whole focus is actually not on analytic thinking, though analytic thinking is used to come to something else. So perhaps we have perfected in ideation and in argumentation, but the purpose is not ending there. The purpose is to look at something else, and that is where the question of being comes. And even if you look at a contemporary philosopher like Jiddu Krishnamurti, I was just reading that he was very much against the whole idea of distinguishing consciousness into something which is conscious and something which is unconscious. Of course, his reference was to, perhaps what Freud and his contemporaries said, of giving more importance to what is perhaps the deeper level of unconscious, where everything else comes together and decides human living and human decisions, and also the reason for your psychological mental health dispositions and relationships which you form with your family members. Then you see that Jiddu Krishnamurti himself was very unhappy with such a division of consciousness into something which is superficially conscious and unconscious as deeper. So if you look at Freud, what is conscious to him is a very, very small space, a very small fraction. And the larger fraction is the unconscious part, which is deeper and which is like an iceberg, and you don't see it unless you hit it, unless it hits you. So while perhaps the aspects of knowing, cognition, etc., was given importance by several of the philosophers and thinkers, what perhaps took their imagination to a very creative way is, where does awareness lead you? So you cannot just say that it is only awareness of what you are experiencing in your day-to-day life, which involves, of course, people, objects, entities in the outside realm, and our own inner thoughts and so on in our inner world. So, but then there is something, could be something more. And this something more, if you see, is a line of thought which is chased by thinkers from the classical period to people, several of the philosophers whom we value in the recent times as well. I don't know of too many philosophers at this stage, so I'm not going to take names from, perhaps any living philosophers as such, but at least some of the notable people whom we know, Bimal Matilal, Kisi Bhattacharya, these are all very important names for anyone who does Indian philosophy. So even if you include them in our discussion, you would see that they all had this yearning to use analytical philosophy to see there was something else which was going on. But then we should not forget that the use of argumentation, the use of perhaps analysis was very central, even in discovering something which is deeper, higher, or which is not knowable. And so that's something which I wanted to share with you. And now what I'm going to do is to share some of my own personal, likings from the texts of Indian philosophy and classical Indian philosophy. And I am sure that many different people have different selections, but these are my favorite selections so that I can share with you perhaps from a personal standpoint, because finally philosophy is going to be very impersonal. If anyone says that philosophy is impersonal, you have to doubt it, because there is no place for impersonal philosophy. There is no place for impersonal. So everybody has their own way of looking at philosophy, particularly in Indian philosophy, gives you that advantage, gives you that facility. It facilitates that personalization of metaphysical thinking. So let me go through some of these ideas in the context of discussing consciousness. And perhaps at the end, I might also say a little bit about the consciousness studies discussion in large, what's happening today, but maybe there is time. But it's amazing to see that several thousands of years back, people could ask a question like, who can know the knower? And this is something which I'm taking from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And you must be knowing what I'm talking about. Are kena vijaniyad. That is the last part of that. I hope you remember what I am talking about. Vijnataram are kena vijaniyad. So, hey, who can know the knower? I mean, why would you even ask such a question, that who would know the knower? Because who is interested in the knower at all? What we are interested is in knowing what is outside us, right? What is existing outside. So your question back would be, we are trying to analyze the reality of objects and things which I am perceiving, which I am feeling with my skin, and which I am perhaps hearing. And so I'm looking into the reality of the sensate world, which is so much in front of me. The sensory inputs, which I'm getting every second. So I'm interested perhaps in knowing what these are. What is the physiology of it? How can these be understood? Definitely, there are sciences which go into the description and the explanation for the function of these sensory mechanisms and the sensate world itself. But then what is philosophy doing? Philosophy, first of all, admits that there is something else other than perhaps the functional explanations which we give to perhaps, for example, what we see with our eyes. The assumption is that there is something which is still not known. And this is what I started this discussion with. So people criticize philosophy for this because there is philosophy as a belief that certain things cannot be known at all. How can you even engage in a discussion when you already have an assumption that certain things are unknowable? Well, then that is the fact, that certain things are unknowable. But why are they unknowable? Are they eternally unknowable? Or what is the utility of knowing perhaps at all is also important. And I think that is why the Nayayika tradition, when it comes, the whole concept of Sabhalada becomes very, very important. We may discuss the Nayayika argumentation for several other situations, but if you focus on this whole idea of Sabhalada and how a particular action has to come into fruition in order to perhaps look at its validity is very, very important, which again brings in the idea that certain things has to be perhaps, even if they are unknowable, they have to be looked into till we fall apart. And the whole discussion on the many unknowables, there are many unknowables in Indian philosophy, of course, like in other philosophies as well. It is not just only one unknowable. There are a range of unknowables. And the unknowability of these also are relational, which means certain things are partly knowable, certain things are a little more knowable, and certain things are unknowable, and certain things are not even necessary to be knowable because they are already so ubiquitous, or they are so default, they are just there. So you don't have to know it, you are just experience it, just like that. So that there is a range of knowability given in Indian metaphysics. And where does mind and consciousness fall in this range of knowability? That's a very, very difficult question actually to ask. And interestingly, many of the discussions, if we bringing in consciousness, it starts with the discussion on mind and cognitive functions and the agent himself or herself. And that is why this Brihadaranyaka Upanishad question, who can know the knower, becomes very important. And is it something which perhaps the author of the Upanishad asking in a very perhaps as if something which cannot be known at all? I mean, perhaps this is an impossibility. You cannot know the knower at all, because what you can know only is that which is presented to us, and that which is, or who is trying to know cannot be known, or perhaps there's no need of knowing. All these sub-questions are hidden under this larger question, who can know the knower? And there are other certain set of questions in the Kena Upanishad, which is again another favorite of mine. And this perhaps, I'm sure some of you at least are familiar with this. Kene shidam padade preshidam mana. Kena prana prathama praiti yuktaha. Kene shidam vajamimam vadanti. Takshushrotau devo yunakti. So this Upanishad again starts with a series of questions. And it asks, driven by what does the mind descend on things? Enjoined with what does the vital breath function? driven by what such words are spoken, and what directs and illumines the eyes and ears, if I have a little bit of a loose translation of these lines. So what does push the mind to fall into objects and to bring in knowledge? So the idea of knowledge is that the mind is going somewhere and perhaps blotting up. It's like a litmus paper, blotting something which is falling into it and then bringing it back to you, and you affirm for yourself what is blotted in that paper of the mind. So how does mind does this? So Kainishidam padadi preshidam mana. So is there a driving force behind the mind? Is mind driven by something else? And I think this is a very interesting question, and it's a very dangerous question as well, because if we are using just perhaps a few available notions and style of argumentation, you may reach nowhere with such a question. Because how do we know who is the knower? Because the whole idea is that the knower tries to know what is to be known, right? The knower tries what is unknown. So how can the known be known at all? And a further question is, it is not only who is the knower, but before the knower, because if you consider the knower as perhaps an abstract entity, let's come to less abstract entity, relatively less abstract, such as the sensory organ itself, or the sensory functions itself, like the act of seeing or the act of hearing. How does that happen? What encourages me to see something? What encourages me to listen something? The whole world is full of its own cacophony or melody, but then I choose to listen to certain sounds, certain rhythm, or certain words, and my attention is given to perhaps a few words and not all the words. As I'm speaking, I know that different people take different words. All of you may not be attending all the words, but certain words mark a meaning for you. So what is that which encourages me to select a few words, to give attention to certain words? This is important. You may say this in a very technical manner, that how does cognition happen at all? Why are we endowed with different cognitive capabilities? That it gives you a range of choices for our sensory experiences on what we perceive. So that question is also asked in this set of questions by the Kena Upanishad. But yet, the question which is not forgotten is, who is trying to know things? And this is something which is so fundamental, because you really have to break that bridge in order to get to the other side. So the only way to get to the other side, as per this contention or the question, is breaking the bridge itself, the bridge which you are using to get to the other side. Now, if you break the bridge, how do you get to the other side? That I wouldn't be able to say it, but I think everybody has their own imagination, their own tenacity, their own resilience to build perhaps another bridge, or may perhaps discover other ways of travel to get to the other side. But the idea perhaps the author here brings in is that you have to break your bridges. Those comfortable bridges which you have been using have to be broken down, and you have to perhaps see other modes of travel. Now, there are several other interesting ideas in the Upanishadic literature itself. I'm just looking at the Upanishadic literature because there won't be much time to go into the various classical systems, but though I might say a few ideas from it. Another very, what should I say, seemingly contradictory position is taken in the Taittiriya Upanishad. And this is something which is extremely exciting. And this particular text says that food is the highest reality. Ahamannam, or Annam Brahmedi Vedanad. So no food as the highest reality. But then it continues from there and goes to your breath, mind, intellect. And finally it says, Anandam Brahmedi Vyajanad. So know your happiness as perhaps the highest or the deepest reality. And that happiness is unconditional happiness. Of course, we don't discuss about it now, but then we don't, for lack of any other words, we translate Anandam as happiness, but it is a different sort of happiness altogether. So how can you tie up these seemingly contradictory, that to say that food is the most real or the most important, and then in the same breath to say that something which is unconditional is perhaps the true real, it is truly real. So how do we tie up these seeming contradictions? And I think this is one of the beauty of Indian metaphysical thinking, that you don't have to give up one to embrace the other. One of the dangerous tendencies which I see, not in philosophy, but in any kind of dialogue or decision making today, is that you have to give up several other things in order to decide one thing. And the assumption is that in order, if you are given many possibilities, you have to give up the rest to take up one. And that is something which we have to, I think, critically examine, that can we build a range, a relative possibility, the possibility of a travel from one end to the other end without denigrating or without perhaps upgrading something to be highest or lowest. So this is, I think, the major contribution of Indian metaphysics when it comes to understanding consciousness, that unlike perhaps the major theories on consciousness as dividing it into conscious, subconscious, and conscious, or several other such divisions, what perhaps Indian metaphysics does is to bridge your cognitive capability with your ability to see something beyond, and at the same time by being with what is available. And this may seem to be very hard, particularly philosophically, because if we are using just only our intellectual capabilities or just as a cerebral exercise, you may ask, how can you even think something which is more of a causal origin by not giving up perhaps what you see as an effect or something as emergent? And this is something which I think we all have to go through these philosophical textual traditions and these philosophical engagements to understand how that travel is made possible. And so one of my another very favorite idea, which again is important in establishing the argument which I am trying to present to you, is from Kena Upanishad, Pradibodha Vididam, something which is known every moment. You know, one of our difficulty as psychological beings, as cultural beings, is discontinuity. You have to discontinue something in order to do something else. So our decision making is also between the possibilities of continuity and discontinuity. And that is why if you look at a lot of discussions, you would see that, oh, Indian philosophy says give up the material world, and we don't even know what is the material world, in order to perhaps see something which is of a causal origin. And it is hard perhaps for people or for thinkers to accept that things need not happen in a discontinuous manner or in a dislocated and a disunited manner, but it can happen in a continuous manner itself. So the idea of continuity, again, is something which we have to give importance. And that is why any amount of argumentation which is only based on a text or based only on your cerebral activity or maybe a tradition of argumentation will not help you unless you go there, take a position, and allow your position to be perhaps, critiqued by other possibilities. So such an open attitude is very important, even to understand perhaps what some of these texts try to share with us regarding concepts like mind and consciousness. Well, there are several systems in Indian philosophy. Of course, people who are new to Indian philosophy would gradually get introduced. As Dr. Srini said, they will gradually get introduced. I like the way when he said in WhatsApp message, they will gradually be introduced to Indian philosophy. It's a nice way of thinking, you get gradually introduced because introductions actually have to be gradual and it ends only after 2 years. And still it's an introduction. It may not go further because the idea is that we retain the freshness of these ideas, these concepts. There are a couple of ideas still I wish to share with you. One is, again, I think we have to bring in certain central notions in philosophy as large in a global discussion. Of course, this whole idea of the subject-object divide and subjectivity versus objectivity and so on. So this, of course, has a historical origin, both in the West, not necessarily in the East, because we didn't have those binaries as such, because even our binaries were too complex. Even the binaries were very layered. So you cannot pinpoint to a particular narrow definition to those binaries. Even some of the systems do talk about those kind of metaphysical entities. But even today, it's interesting that in consciousness studies, one of the major discussion is relating to the subjective quality of consciousness. That how does consciousness give you a qualitative feeling about it? And because if it is a completely electrochemical function, how is that you're getting a feeling about it? Where is the subject there? How can a subject originate from the object? So this is again that fallacy which perhaps has a historical origin. Of course, in the West, starting with 14th century and so on, I don't know perhaps whether Indian philosophy or Indian philosophers did that kind of a binary division, perhaps in a very limited manner, but not in perhaps the Cartesian history which we are talking about. But, in order to see something which is deeper, something which is so personal, something which is very qualitative and something which is experiential, do they need to have a particular kind of origin is a question which is asked in consciousness studies. That is why the whole question called the hard problem of consciousness, that how is something which is physical can give rise to something which is non-physical. So we are basically engaging with a very limited possibilities of binaries like physical and non-physical, subject and the object. And the subjective itself has a lot of objectiveness in it, a lot of things which are embedded in it, which has an objective nature. It's not that all of us, the person as a whole is a subject. No, the subject itself has a lot of objective attributes. So even when we talk about me as a subject, what do we mean by me as a subject? This is a very detailed discussion which most of the Saddarshana does, the 6 philosophical systems of Indian philosophy, the Shaddarshana does, starting from, Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, and so on. And for this, they did bring in certain opposing metaphysical entities. But in the course of explanation, these entities are viewed perhaps in a tied up manner and not in a dislocated and disunited manner. So there is a context which gives a unity. There's a context which gives a whole picture in most of the Shaddarshana systems, if you look at them. But again, what is interesting is that though we may not immediately find, there is a narrative which is built in by almost all systems of Indian philosophy, the classical time, the narrative of the self. And that is why the discussion on consciousness cannot be complete without the discussion on self. And if you look at the contemporary discussions in consciousness studies, one of the most important and exciting ideas is the self. And even if you come to AI and consciousness, the question of sentience, or the question of life becoming something more concrete as a self becomes very important. So the question of self has a history which perhaps Indian philosophy can boast. If you look at all the classical systems of Indian philosophy, and even some of the indigenous communities, if you look at their way of living, you can see that the idea of self, the idea of experientiality, the idea of being a participant and an observer. For example, in anthropology, a participant observation method is something very, very important in order to understand layered experiences. So it's very central in indigenous communities, ways of looking at cosmology, ways of looking at people's life after death, and so on. And we also have to remember that when we talk about consciousness in the context of metaphysics, health is a central point of view which Indian philosophical system takes. And I don't want to miss that point. Whether we take classical system of Ayurveda, of Charaka, Sushruta, and Vagbhada, or even the indigenous healers who, I was very lucky to meet and know about in some of my studies in tribal communities, that how much importance is given to the continuity between health and other phases of the self. So the self is not something which you can dislocate from your own health. And of course, I don't have to talk about yoga itself, which definitely is the magnum opus for health in various contexts, whether it's physical, mental, environmental, and so on. But what is interesting is that the idea of health is no more just an idea, but it is something which is very living, and it also is not just a biomedical idea. And that is, again, which is very, very central when it comes to Indian philosophy, that the idea of health is not just biomedical, but it is very environmental, which is very holistic, which is very personal. And it is also a sense of narrative is also built into health, which means health has to be understood, not just perhaps as we see in modern medicine with the help of molecules, biomolecules, but also perhaps within the context of what constitutes reality, what constitutes your environment, what constitutes your food. So there's a lot of philosophy in food itself. And that is why perhaps, someone could state that food is the highest reality. And why I wanted to say this, all this is, even today, I happen to meet people who tell me that, oh, Indian philosophy is all otherworldly, it is all metaphysical, nobody understands. Not really. I mean, which philosophy can say that food is the ultimately most philosophically valid entity? Which philosophy would say that? Even if you look at, the discussions on rasa, whether both in Natya Shastra as well as in culinary practices of Indian thinking, it's amazing, that the idea of taste and flavor is given such a cosmic dimension. So it's not that you bite a pinch of potato chips and then forget about it. It is much more than that. Flavor and taste is taken to a completely different level. I don't want to go into it. I'm so tempted to talk about food itself, because food itself is so important a concept when we talk about consciousness. Most of the time when we talk about consciousness, we talk about something which is so ephemeral that nobody understands, nobody has a feel about it. But if we have to talk about consciousness in a very personalized manner, we have to bring in ideas which are empirical, such as food, such as our postures. And all this is done in Indian philosophy. I'm not one of those people, who would like to say, oh, everything is in Indian philosophy, everything. No, there are several things perhaps not in Indian philosophy, but it is worth acknowledging that this system of thinking gave importance to deeper ideas in a very concrete, in a very grounded manner. So that is why most of Indian metaphysics, you see, grounded, and I use the word grounded very consciously, in the sense that it is grounded in a lived experience. And it is not that we talk about ideas in a very abstract level alone, that where it is all floating. No, it is not about ideas and concepts that are floating, which we are talking about, but which are very grounded. And I think that is where consciousness becomes very important and interesting in Indian philosophy, that we can have several narratives about consciousness. We don't talk about the consciousness, perhaps, but we talk about how a person orients towards very interesting, deeper attributes of consciousness. Or when I say deeper, I don't mean that something which is only deeper, but something perhaps which is immediately available at itself. So the whole definition of depth, not as something which you discover when you fathom deeper and dig more alone, but something which is deep because it is available in every moment of our experience. That is why that whole idea of pratibodha viditam, that you don't give up something in order to find something else which you don't even know about. And that is why the Gita philosophy also, which of course, I have some background in the Gita. That's how I started my interest in philosophy. From biology, I shifted to philosophy because of that text, that what a magnificent way of connecting human action, agency, to perhaps a larger scenario of our thinking and consciousness itself. How freedom is explained in a very concrete and lived manner. And the whole idea of detachment talked about, not perhaps as we just in a very, what should I say, meaningless manner, we talk about just giving up. But then there are very interesting ideas of detachment itself. It is not just giving up, because even, recently, I see people talking about, oh, it's all about giving up. Indian philosophy is all giving up, and then we talk about something which cannot be given up. It's all absolutely notions which come because we have not read about these ideas, we have not gone into it. There is more embracing than giving up in Indian philosophy. You actually embrace more and you give up less, because it is in that embrace what you see constitutes the periphery of your experience. So the whole metaphorical notion behind giving up is to see the periphery, and perhaps also to have this back and forth travel between the center to the periphery and see that radius, how it goes. And I think maybe we'll have some discussion. But before that, I will also send you one paper. I'll share you the paper here itself. Dr. Srini asked me for any reading. But I wanted to, and this paper, which I'm going to share with you, is the following. Maybe I'll just share it, so I don't want to show you a screenshot of it. It is a paper by Margaret Chatterjee, one of more recent Indian philosophers. And she looks at 3 Indian philosophers, including K.C. Bhattacharya and 2 others, to understand what is Indian metaphysics and how these people have conceived Indian metaphysics. And it is very heartening when she writes about K.C. Bhattacharya, for example, that though he used argumentation as, or he believed in argumentation as something so central in Indian philosophy, the analytical frameworks are so central to Indian philosophy, he believed that such frameworks should allow us to tie up things and not just to untie things and let them loose. So the whole idea of stitching or seeing a thread which goes through different notions and different facets of our experience is very important. And Margaret Chatterjee, as you would know, that is a very interesting thinker. And I'm going to share this particular paper to you. And I think those of you can, okay, this is, no, I think I should give you by chat, sorry. So I'm just sharing in your chat message. Give me 1 second. Yeah. So, yeah, so that is where I wish to perhaps stop and see whether you have any questions. We can continue to discuss, I think, for some more time, as far as I understand. The time allocation is like that. Thank you. You are muted, Dr. Stefan.
First, I would like to ask our students and those online to join me in congratulating you. That was actually very holistic talk, and with quite a load of meaningful questions. And then to these questions, I'm going to question the questioner. And then who am I to question the questioner? And who questions the questioner here is quite all problematic. And you've raised these questions themselves, and I'm still wondering. In any case, to kind of bridge, although you also mentioned that we need to burn some of these bridges, which I thought was evocative metaphor. Thank you for that one. But please allow me to at least try to build one with you on this here. For you have set the ground for talking about metaphysics, and metaphysics is actually what I teach here as I share this subject with my colleague Srinivasan goes in the epistemology. I do the metaphysics, and you already touched on so much. So on this, we have a bridge to have this dialogue. And there is also the topics you mentioned, which are of deep interest to me, on which I would like to question the questioner, if you allow me, so that perhaps I can open the dance and further people could raise questions after me. As always, somebody needs to break the ice. You mentioned, detachment and renunciation, something that I tend to read often through the prism of self-sacrifice, because of these two notions that are so important, in the South Asian or Indian tradition, if you want. First, the notion of self, but especially the notion of sacrifice. And I would be interested if you could share with us perhaps your opinion of the relationship of metaphysics to self-sacrifice, or the relation of metaphysics to detachment, perhaps in a more concrete way, and then take this to reflect on the relevance of reflecting on that relation today. So that would be my question. Just to rephrase it again, the relation of studying metaphysics, as they did in the ancient time and today, the relation of this to detachment or renunciation, and the importance of that kind of reflection today. Your own opinion on that. I'm very curious to hear you.
Thank you so much for that very interesting question and your kind words. What is that which can be given up? I mean, I guess the idea behind detachment is that you give up something, or you don't get touchy about things, right? Detachment itself, I mean, the idea behind is don't get touchy about things, or you practice a certain sense of detachment. So what is that which you give up? Can you give up anything at all? I mean, that's something interesting question, Dr. Stefan, I think. Can you give up anything at all? What do you give up? Is giving up a practice, or is giving up a reflective exercise? And I think it starts from the second, which is a reflective exercise, which is that what is that which you can really give up? And one of my favorite texts from the Vedantic tradition is Dritrisha Vivekam, which gives you a very analytic framework of how things are stitched up and how do we analyze so that at least we know where we can find this interspatial spaces where we can take a breather. And so the connection between philosophy and detachment or self-sacrifice. So my question would be, is it possible to give up anything at all? So that is, I think I would say, because the idea that we think by giving up is really giving up. But then there are several things which you don't even realize you have given up, right? I mean, yesterday I was seeing a documentary in Sony BBC Earth by some of these sweet manufacturing factories. The amount of sweets they manufacture and sits perhaps 100 years, and the variety of sweets, and from its production, basically it's called I forget the name of it, but inside the factory, if at all you're interested in that. So how these sweets are produced, and it is so coveting. It is so exciting and enticing to see. But then, as I was seeing, I was thinking, am I interested in these sweets now? Perhaps I discovered that though I do have a sweet tooth, and sweet is something which I very much like, it doesn't interest me so much. So I don't even have to boast saying that, oh, I have given up sweet. It's just that it has naturally perhaps happened. So when we say giving up, we think there is a very positive, painful effort behind giving up. That is something which we have to question. So is giving up a practice, a reflective practice, or is an act which involves effort and most of the time painful? If it is a painful effort, according to most of the systems of Indian philosophy on action and renunciation, if it is a painful effort, better not to give up, because that pain is going to perhaps decide. That is why it is more a reflective exercise than a physical exercise. It's a more a reflective exercise than a physical action of giving up. So what do you give up? So what is that which is given up has to naturally drop off. It has to naturally drop off. You don't have to pluck it and throw it out. It has to naturally perhaps drop off. And how does it naturally drop off? With enough reflective exercises that you go, with enough analysis of things, with enough reflection and with enough analysis, you develop insights, you develop choices, you develop interests that make the so-called giving up a very naturally happening experience. So in such an experience, there is no effort, there is no pain. Basically, you don't even think that you have given up something, because there is no act of excluding something in order to get into something. And that is why I think the exercise is not based on a binary of getting something new by giving up something old. And I think which is again based on a very consumerist society, that you have to give up something which is already there in order to get something new. And we all are perfectionists in that, right? I mean, the life period of the things which we use in our kitchen or in our study room, it's so limited. And we don't even think how much they can be recycled before they can be used. Are they bioorganic materials? Are they biodegradable? So in a sense, we can say that our idea of giving up in order to gain something is also based on a faulty thinking that by giving up, you get something, or giving up is an actual act we have to do. But on the contrary, giving up is a reflective exercise which helps you perhaps to see something more and to facilitate travel to something, to a different place. Such a giving up is needed, but then that is very much based on reflective exercises and ratiocinations.
Thank you so much for engaging in that question beautifully. I would like to invite our guests either online or in person here to build bridges with our questioner and question the questioner themselves. Perhaps those wishing to question could raise their hand online and may make a sign, but I see already in class one hand raised. Perhaps what I will do, if you allow me, Professor Menon, I will sit back with our students and you could look and direct the question so that it would be a bit more dynamic if I don't have to change the camera.
Sure. I can do
All
that.
right?
Yes,
Okay.
I can do that.
So please, perhaps you could remind us your name and so that we have a human contact and you can go with your question.
Namaste, madam. I'm Sriharsha.
Namaste.
Yeah, I'm Sriharsha.
So can you be a little louder? Maybe can you just come forward, because I have to really strain my ear to hear all the words you're saying.
They can see your face. You have to come a bit behind.
Yeah.
So I have a question, madam. You said that Indian philosophy is not merely talking about metaphysical things or like discussing tedious theories. Rather, it is pragmatic one. So I would like to know what is the relevant applications of Indian philosophy in today's India. Thank you.
Oh, that's as large as India question, I would say, and it will take a long time. So when you say in today's India, what is the perhaps relevance of Indian philosophy as a pragmatic philosophy? If I translate that question in the sense, I think it gives us the edge in thinking. Particularly if you are interested in artificial intelligence, you would see that most of the concepts which are available now in a global scenario, which talks about sentience and consciousness, is so limited. So it helps you to give a different dimension altogether, to understand what is happening in AI and how it will impact in not only India, but the global world, perhaps in another 5 to 10 years in such a limited period. So to me, if you ask me, one of the greatest contributions of Indian philosophical systems, particularly metaphysics, and again, based on concepts on consciousness, cognition, cognitive capabilities, is to engage with a dialogue in AI, which is something which you and I will not be able to, detach in any sense in the next coming few years. Yeah. And I would like to hear your thinking. What do you think? If I may.
Yeah, definitely, madam. As this is a techno-marginal driven world, definitely artificial intelligence like GPT and all, we can use the contribution of Indian philosophy. I think we can use the Gautama's Nyaya Shastra logic. We can apply the Nyaya logic to further improve and enhance the artificial intelligence capabilities. That's what I thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Because one of the question, as in another 5 to 10 years, is, do you need a self at all? Because if all those AI entities which you use, including your Alexa, Google Assistant, and so on and so forth, just as the driverless cars, perhaps we can have selfless bodies, where things can just happen. So that is a very, very interesting scenario, which I think we'll be able to dialogue based on Indian metaphysical ideas. Yes, anybody else? Please come in and just come forward so that I can see you and hear you. If you have a question, not necessarily a question, you can also have your own comment, your own thinking, sharing what you think as you sit in this class today for the first time, perhaps starting a journey for another 2 years with all the professors there. So what is your thinking? That I think is extremely important.
I just want to congratulate you for certain things that you brought out in your lecture, particularly in the era where you started also your lecture with this remark is that whether there is something called Indian philosophy in a certain sense that A.K. Ramanujan would put it like, is there an Indian way of thinking? So you brought this idea and what that Indian would, is it historical, is it geopolitical, is it referring to a living tradition? And also there is a wide problem associated with so-called classical Indian philosophy, is that whether a particular section of society, whether they had participation in it or not, and then I would consider this lecture and you as a testimonial to say that premising upon your lecture is that Indian philosophy is not only of the past, it's even the past holds some sort of relevance and we have to explore and experience what sort of relevance that it holds. So it's a living tradition. So, and to what extent, whether Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva or other Indian philosophers to the contemporary people, whether it be yourself or even my own colleague Carl here, or my former colleagues, or even B.K. Matilal or K.C. Bhattacharya, or even other people like those who are working in India and around the world, whether it is Ganeri or whoever it is, so it's not that we have to only refer to the classical texts that are merely written in Sanskrit and then think that philosophy, because to what extent Sanskrit texts are being produced now, to what extent that there is that reproductivity that is actually functioning. In that sense, Indian philosophy is a living tradition, and because India is such a diverse country, it translates itself, it translanguages itself, and it is a living tradition that could deal with a lot of things that we are encountering in today's world. What are the responses that the classical tradition as well as the contemporary people, and you being a woman philosopher, which we are very proud to have, it's very rare to find such people, to be honest, have brought these discussions to the, not only for the people, there are a lot of people online. I was surprised for their age group, the work that they are doing and they are engaged with. And the present younger generation that are sitting here, some of them are not here, around 3-4 people are not here. So it is, lecture has provoked a lot of questions, particularly on the aspect of subjectivity and objectivity. Is there an objectivity or not? Is there an impersonality or not? Or is everything subjective? And to what extent what is subjective? And is there collectivity? Even if there is subjectivity, is there collectivity or not? So, so these questions have been very provoking, and I hope students would take this lecture as a bedrock, and then take for the next, not just for the 2 years to complete their masters, but even for their PhD and their future, wherever they would like to settle themselves. So they take it forever. So I feel that has been the substance of the lecture. So I really congratulate you for accepting our invitation and doing this honors for us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Srinivasan, and for your kind words. And I think you summarized in a very beautiful manner. That was more beautiful than what I said. Some of these very, very exciting possibilities based on Indian philosophy. And philosophy has to be taken out of those shelves of mere abstract thinking, and which has nothing to do with contemporary issues and contemporary problems. So perhaps we have to take up case studies, where we can bring in philosophy. And for example, climate change is one of that, where people's attitude has to be different, attitude has to be changed. in order to understand what is happening to climate. So there are a lot of scenarios where we can bring in practical philosophy, applied philosophy. So today, I think, is the age of applied philosophy. And philosophy will lose its charm or if it is just a cerebral activity, because most of the time I feel that if it is just a cerebral activity, even the person who talks about it won't have a feeling about it, let alone others. So yeah, I completely agree with you that the way we do philosophy has to bring in argumentation, has to bring in analytic frameworks, but then that's all to integrate our various experiences, not to disunite and not to perhaps lead to a very schizophrenic existence, a schizoid existence, but to unite, but to integrate. And it's also very interesting, this metaphor. Integration is not pulping them all to one material. Then because, you like your paper, you pulp and you get a paper pulp. Not like that. The metaphor is as a string, you go through the different pearls, which means each of the string in that particular ornament has a value, as a phase, as a distinct personality. And most of the time, the thread is not even seen. So I think consciousness is that thread. It gives you the possibilities of magnificent ways of argumentation, magnificent ways of grounding our own experiences, at the same time touching the beyond and relishing its beauty, imaginative possibilities. Yeah, I agree.
Did it very well with
yes. Sorry.
7th chapter, Sutre Manigana Iva metaphor.
Yes, that's Sutre Manigana Iva. Yes, exactly.
I would like to continue on what you were saying. I mean, I think you already draw some lines there, but I'm curious as to what for you the challenges in front of us of teaching Indian philosophy in India today. Like, what are some of these challenges that perhaps you have some solutions? I mean, you've already drawn some, like saying, going more toward applied philosophy and incarnating the teachings into something more perhaps worldly and substantial, but still I'm curious as to what you see as being the current challenges today to teach and make this tradition available to students.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Karl. And I think this is a very, very important question for all of us as students and teachers, that what kind of methodologies should we use in our curriculum, in our pedagogic structures. I think it's extremely important. And I think we have to perhaps experiment with various possibilities, and those possibilities include perhaps moving away from the classroom and sitting in another open space, so that you don't have to think that the classroom is generating philosophy. The classroom doesn't generate philosophy. Philosophy is already there. You just get to attune to it. You have to breathe that fresh air. So perhaps changing the place of your teaching from a beautiful classroom like this, of course, to perhaps other places. And I've also seen people experimenting like walking philosophy. You go for a walk, and during the walk, you present different philosophers, different philosophies, and these walking philosophies, maybe once in a month, you go for a walk, and then the walk, a walk itself is a philosophical enterprise, but then it also brings you the enjoyment of discussing and talking philosophy. And a couple of other possibilities, because I myself experimented, and these are my personal interests. Of course, I don't know how much of you would agree. I would say that using literature, movies, and other elements from social sciences in order to contextualize and discuss philosophy. So because if we use only philosophical ideas to understand philosophical ideas, it becomes very cerebral. Nobody will understand. Of course, you can boast of a certain scholarship, which will be very verbal, but it has nothing to do with your blood and sinews. So use examples or case studies from literature, social sciences. And that is why I think Mahabharata is a perennial source for us, because there's so much we can contextualize within Mahabharata to understand many of the metaphysical ideas which we talk about. Because of its own antiquity, a lot of other classical ideas which we talk about in Shaddarshana, you can see those coming in certain ways. And the other possibility is making it more participative, breaking the very mainstream, the so-called mainstream ways of teaching, such as someone teaches, someone speaks for 1 hour, and then the rest of the students speak. No, make it more participative, make it more building up, make it more cumulative, make it more generative than just one person oriented. So it becomes a team effort, because the best philosophy happens when the team works together than one philosopher sitting and philosophizing. So it has to be a joint activity. So there are so many ways of doing this. Therefore, I think the best way to approach philosophy is to take it as a creative exercise. So finally, doing philosophy, to me personally, is a very creative exercise. Thank you. Thank you for that very important question.
Thank you so much for your answer. Perhaps we take one last question, if there is any, because we have already outdone our time and extended your generosity. I don't want to stretch it so much. Is there anybody else who would like to?
And online, I see online also, I don't know, I saw some clap or hand from Subhashri Raman. Or anybody else want to say something? I mean, it can be a question or a comment. I see at least 4 more people in the audience.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for a wonderful session. I totally agree with your walking philosophy. If that being practiced, I think this will just give more interest to the youngsters to learn about Indian epistemology, learning in depth the nuances of philosophy as such, and how to get practice. Practice in philosophy will be much more easier than reading it in the text. I feel that way. Thank you so much for suggesting.
Thank you so much. I was just thinking why walking perhaps will be useful. One is philosophy critiques any set notions of purpose and destinations, because any philosophical enterprise as such is a critique on set notions of life purposes and destinations. For example, I want to go from point 1 to point 2. So in walking, perhaps we forget those destinations. We don't have to reach anywhere. We don't have to set a purpose, but doing itself becomes a purpose. So you don't have to have a separate purpose. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And in the process, you lose yourself to find the supreme.
That's right.
Yes. Thanks so much, ma'am, for making philosophy so easy to understand. And getting back to our roots itself, I've been very fond of philosophy while I was doing my PG. And now getting back to my learning and brushing my memory, this has given me an opportunity. Thanks so much, ma'am, for engaging this 1 hour. Just flight off. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Ma'am, it was a wonderful session. This is Anand.
Yeah, hi, Anand.
Extremely
I can't see you. I mean, none
informative.
of you I can see. Maybe your bandwidth is issue.
Yeah. It's extremely informative. And it's a wonderful session. And, you talked about giving up. See, in this world, not only giving up, even if you want to get something, without putting in efforts, it is not possible. Everything goes with efforts, right? Even if you want to have, something, give up, as you rightly said, it requires a lot of efforts. The same way to get something also. So if at all you want to give something up, I would say we have to give up selfishness. We should be absolutely selfless.
Which is an impossibility, I guarantee you.
No, see, as you rightly said, Everything is
will
difficult.
have to be, and remember that, conversation between Yajnavalkya and his wife.
Yes,
He
yes,
says
yes.
everybody is selfish. So, but what do we mean? So that's why today we talk about enlightened selfishness. You cannot be altruistic in a sense, which is of putting yourself into a great difficulty and then giving up. So that is why the ideas like empathy bridges these old notions of selfishness and selflessness. Empathy is taking care of yourself at the same time by feeling for another person. You cannot feel for another person if you don't feel yourself. So in order to be selfless, first of all, we have to know what's going on between us. What is that which we require? So that's why it will not be against any Darwinian idea, because as a earlier biologist, I would say that the whole discussion on altruism or giving up is not antagonistic to our own survival needs, or to reconcile that it has to be a collective existence, that it can be shared. So ideas like selfishness, it is today, I think we have to now bring in more vocabulary like sharing, co-learning, participative, co-inhabiting, co-creating. So it's not necessary that selfishness and selflessness alone. It can be actually doing things together as well, Mr. Anand. I thought I should.
Yeah, true. You said it very correctly. We must define what exactly it is. According to me, maybe I may be wrong. I would say whatever I do, I include you also into it. That means the beneficiary is not me alone. You are also a beneficiary. So in that way, I am definitely, considering anything for myself.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful session. Yeah.
All right. So we will conclude on this last, I would say, thoughtful, selfful, and selfless perspective. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Menon. I wish that we could have, at least that I could have the chance to know the knower that you are, perhaps more in person another time. But again, thank you for your extreme generosity and the time you've taken with us. It was priceless. I wish you all the best, and let's hope we can meet again. And thank you in the name of the Department of Philosophy here at Manipal to those who attended online, and obviously our students in person for their patience and participation. Thank you so much. We will end this session now. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Karl, Stefan, for the kind words, and also for your philosophical thinking. And I definitely would like to come over there and meet you in person, which I missed this time. And I hope we can continue this discussion since you already said we have common areas, intersecting areas of interest. And I also thank Dr. Srinivasan for the invite from the start to the end. And it will be a pleasure to meet all of you in person. And thank you, all the students and all the people who have attended this program. It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Namaste.